Good morning, everybody. Over the last couple of weeks, we've talked quite a lot about the Boris wave, the absolutely catastrophic decision by the last Conservative government to open the doors unconditionally to millions of people, only 20% of whom actually came with work permits. But today, I want to return to a theme that I suppose I've been more directly involved with politically than anybody else. It does seem a very long time ago when I first started going out in the spring of 2020 into the English Channel, filming the boats, saying there was a massive emerging story here, and that you might just as well put a sign on the White Cliffs of Dover saying, "Everybody welcome," because the only possible deterrent to illegal immigration is, of course, for people to be detained and deported, as they would be in virtually every other country in the world. And indeed, as would have happened in this country and as was written into law back in 1971 in legislation. Well, my prediction that there would be an invasion has proved to be true, even if some people at the time did not like the use of that word. And of course, on Saturday just gone, another 602 people crossed the English Channel. And the big news story today is the boats are now launching from Belgium, and the Belgians hand them over to the French, and in line with the wing three-quarters that operates in the Channel, they then get handed on at the 12-mile line to the British. And there's been much negotiation between the Home Secretary and the French over the course of the last few weeks. We've given the French £800 million since 2014 to stop the boats, and we're negotiating the next round. But it's all completely and utterly irrelevant. Because if you cross the English Channel by boat, or if you hide yourself in the back of a lorry, or if you come on a visitor visa or a work visa from Pakistan or wherever else it may be and overstay, your chances, despite being in Britain illegally, your chances of remaining in the country stand at just over 97%. So it's a virtual cert. Get onto a boat, pay a trafficker, throw your passport and iPhone into the sea at the 12-mile line so that nobody can really identify you or check you, and you will be able to stay. And so what we want to talk about is some very, very simple, basic principles that need to be put in place. Australia succeeded with this back in 2012 by simply saying that no one that comes to Australia illegally on a boat from Indonesia, and the principles are remarkably similar, that nobody that ever comes via this route will ever be able to claim refugee status. That was the first significant act of the Abbott administration, followed up by boats then, even when a few more did start to come, boats simply being towed back to Indonesia. And guess what? The boats stopped coming completely. The other alarming aspect of this is the whole illegal immigration industry. Big companies making vast profits out of housing people in hotels, in houses of multiple occupancy, or wherever it may be, but also the legal profession. And I'm grateful to the BBC for saying what they have over the course of the last couple of days, that there are just too many fake, spurious claims, people claiming to be gay so they can't be sent back. Being just one example, or the other absolute farce is being baptised by Church of England vicars to say suddenly we've become Christian, therefore we can't return to a country that would treat us terribly. And that is why today what we announce is not just that anyone that continues to come illegally will not be allowed to stay under a reform government, but that we will go back 5 years and review all asylum applications. And if there is a belief those applications have been granted because they're bogus, a belief those applications have been granted because the British government feels, both Conservative and Labour, that really their only option is just to wave everybody through. And also if we can see that it is a deliberate, willful misapplication of the good intentions of the Human Rights Act, then those asylum claims will be revoked, and people told, you've come via this route, you will not be allowed to stay. Now, the numbers are substantial, up to 400,000 potentially within the scope of what we're talking about today, on top of a massive problem of people illegally being in Britain, which exists even without this being part of the equation. And I know there'll be people who talk about administratively, how are you going to do it? What's the cost of it going to be? Well, I tell you what, with the calculations that Zia is about to show you, the net benefit to the British economy, we're talking in the short term, many, many billions, and in the long term, we're actually talking telephone numbers in the long term. We're talking 60, 70 billion pounds over a lifetime could be saved by putting this policy in place. But it's the big principle that I want to establish, that nobody will be allowed to stay under a Reform government. And yes, of course, that will mean getting rid of the Human Rights Act. It will mean, of course, for the moment, disapplying the 1951 Convention, which clearly needs to be updated right across the world. And I think there are actually many other countries in Europe now that have reached the same conclusion. And it'll mean doing those things and passing firm legislation in Parliament. But the point of today's press conference is to make absolutely clear that there's no way that British taxpayers and British people should have to live with a whole load of people who illegally broke into our country, who disguised their identities from now living off the British taxpayer, potentially for the rest of their lives, disjointing communities and, perhaps most frustratingly of all, going straight to the top of the social housing list. And I was shocked to learn that there are 15 London boroughs that are now sanctuary boroughs, which means if you come into Britain illegally, you literally go to the top of the list. You're literally at the front of the queue over families who've been part of communities and paid into systems for a very, very long time. It is unfair, it is immoral, it is wrong at every level, and it's one of those issues, in fact, I can't think of a bigger one, in which the public's faith in the whole democratic system has broken down. Repeated promises from prime ministers to stop the boats or smash the gangs, all of which have come literally to naught. And the timing of this, of course, ahead of the warmer summer months, when I have little doubt there'll be many tens of thousands more people who will come into Britain posing a threat, not just to our finances, posing a threat to too many of our women and girls, but equally, given the situation the world is in, posing a genuine threat to our national security. I will, on that note, hand over to Zia to put some more flesh on the bones. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Almost 200,000 people have turned up on our beaches uninvited over the last 8 years. That's more than stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. And today we announced that Reform will reverse this invasion. Last summer, Nigel and I announced Operation Restoring Justice, our plan to detain and deport 600,000 people currently in our country illegally. Now, this plan would involve leaving the ECHR, derogating from a host of international treaties and creating a new agency, UK Deportation Command. Since we announced that policy, we have seen the ongoing invasion of Britain by small boat continue unabated. Starmer's Labour government has continued the Tory betrayal. Hundreds of thousands of those who broke into our country are being granted the right to remain in Britain against the wishes of the British people. So today we announce that in addition to deporting those in this country illegally, a Reform government will review successful asylum grants made over the previous 5 years and revoke them from those who entered the UK illegally or who overstayed their visas. Now that means they will not be allowed to stay in Britain. They'll be given a short time to leave Britain of their own accord, and should they fail to do so, they will be detained and deported. Reform will do what it takes to uphold our laws and secure our borders. The legal and moral argument for this is crystal clear. Tory and Labour governments failed to uphold the law. It has long been illegal to enter Britain illegally under the Section 24 of the Immigration Act 1971. And the fact that the Tory and Labour governments decided not to uphold that law, to allow for the industrial scale trampling of our laws. The fact that Tory and Labour governments presided over an invasion of this country does not mean that a Reform government would allow those who broke our laws to stay here. And the scale of how broken Britain's immigration system is can be illustrated with a quite remarkable fact. An illegal migrant who broke into our country, originally from Syria, yesterday, gets immediate access to taxpayer support. Whereas a world-leading neurosurgeon from New York, who manages to get a visa the proper way, would not be eligible for any taxpayer support for at least 5 years. And the scale of the costs of this is enormous. In accommodation costs alone, it's over £5 billion a year. Add up all the other costs, many of which are kept from us. And this policy will save the British taxpayer tens of billions of pounds over the course of a first Reform Parliament. Now, it was the Tories who were the ones who first told the British people that they'd cut immigration time and again and secure our borders. They said so in 4 consecutive manifestos. Instead, they threw open our borders and oversaw the invasion of Britain. Hundreds of thousands claimed asylum, having arrived illegally or having arrived on false pretenses. The countries from which they most frequently originate include the likes of Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia. The vast majority of these people are fighting-age men about whom we know nothing. And to the degree we do know about them, we know that after breaking into Britain, they are much more likely to be convicted of sex offences in this country than the native population. That's why there is so much anger and fear for the safety of women and girls in the communities in which they have been deposited. Look, the British people are rightly furious. Yes, of course, we all know British people commit crime, but the people we're talking about would never have been in the country and been able to commit that horrific crime had Tory and Labour governments done their most basic duty to operate a secure border. Every sex offence, every murder, every life changed forever by someone who arrived illegally is a tragedy directly downstream from the shameful and cowardly uniparty policy. But that's why the Tories were booted out and why they face electoral annihilation. And then Keir Starmer came to power and quite correctly lambasted the Tories for their, and I quote, open borders experiment. Presumably he then came round to liking that idea, as more illegal migrants have turned up on our beaches under his leadership than that of any Prime Minister in history. And the fact is this: unless the government does all of the following, leave the ECHR, derogate from a host of international treaties that frustrate deportations, and commit to detaining and deporting all those already here illegally, then the boats are just going to continue to come. And clearly the Tories never did any of those things. Clearly Labour will never do any of those things. Reform, led by Nigel Farage, will do every single one of them. We will also terminate welfare payments to foreign nationals and ensure that British welfare is only available to British people. Ultimately, a Reform government will see to it that nobody who came to the country illegally gets to stay. And in doing so, we will set Britain on a path to heal from the many open wounds of failed Tory and Labour governments. A secure border, the deportation of those here illegally, the uncompromising upholding of law and order. That is the foundation upon which a poised, prosperous and powerful Britain will be built. That's what a Reform government led by Nigel Farage as Prime Minister will deliver. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good. Do I have a press list? George? Well, I don't know. Give me a press list and I can work it out. Bear with me. We had I know top of the list was a BBC. Who is here from the BBC? Yes, hello. No. Thank you. Can you make sure the microphone works as well? Right, Jennifer from the BBC.
Testing?
Yes.
Jennifer McKinnon, BBC News. I just wanted to know, how many staff will this policy take, please? And of the civil servants that you want to get rid of, how many will you be rehiring?
The most important thing here is to establish the principle. And the principle is anyone that comes to the United Kingdom illegally will not be allowed to stay. And yes, of course, there are debates about staff and about costs and about gross savings and net savings. Zia, you've done a lot of work on this.
Yeah, look, the short answer to that question is we've announced billions of pounds in savings in terms of civil service payroll. Not a single penny of that comes from Home Office caseworkers. So that's the first point. Number two, everything we're talking about here can be done by the existing workforce simply because rather than having to go through and assess every asylum claim on its merits, they simply have to look at existing Home Office data, which shows quite clearly what the method of entry was. So actually we could clear the entire backlog and get through all of this very quickly indeed.
Thank you. Keith Bayes, GB News.
Hi, Nigel. Firstly, Keir Starmer says he only found out last Tuesday that Peter Mandelson had failed vetting, but reports are suggesting that he was already aware of red flags regarding security. Firstly, what's your reaction to that? If Kemi Badenoch calls a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister, will your party support it? And finally, on your deportation plan, given legal limits, court challenges and the scale involved, how is it actually deliverable? How will your party succeed where others have failed? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, look, last September, David Maddox from The Independent, came out very strongly to say he'd been told from sources inside that Mandelson had failed vetting. And in terms of the red flags, well, we already know that the Prime Minister did read a document about a Russian company that Peter Mandelson's company was directly engaged in, and actually a Russian company in which Mandelson himself was paid, was a director and was a shareholder. So it's impossible for the Prime Minister to say that the warning lights weren't flashing. And if you were Prime Minister, and there were news reports last September that your ambassadorial choice had failed vetting, you would have thought perhaps he might have had some curiosity to try to find out whether this had really happened or not. I just find the whole thing totally incredible. Incredible. There is no way the Prime Minister couldn't have known. You telling me that everyone around him knew and he didn't know? Well, it's possible that he's just a puppet and never consulted on anything, but frankly, it isn't believable. And I do believe strongly that he misled the House of Commons, that he lied to the country, especially. He was so definitive in that Hastings speech that all the necessary channels had been gone through, that vetting had been assured. No, I think he's caught in a terrible trap. If there's a motion of no confidence put down, yes, we would support it, but it's not going to pass. The Labour backbenchers are not yet of a mood to get rid of their Prime Minister, although after May the 7th, they just might be. And, we're campaigning quite strongly around the country, saying vote reform, get Starmer out, and if they have the worst set of local election results, Welsh election results, Scottish election results in the history of the party, then that will certainly do for him. Thank you very much indeed. Legal challenges, obstacles that would come in our way of trying to do these things. Well, I think I made it very clear that you can't do any of these things, all the while we're trapped inside the Human Rights Act with its incorporation of the ECHR within it. That's an obstacle that needs to be removed. And yes, the 1951 UN Refugee Convention is out of date. It's out of date. It needs to be sat down and gone through internationally. It doesn't work as it is, and we would, for the purposes of this, derogate from it. But as I say, I think a lot of other European countries would not fight us on this because they're facing the same political challenges. Indeed, in some ways, because of the catastrophic European Union refugee policy, their problems numerically are even bigger and more serious than ours. Okie dokie. Let's move on to Faye Brown from Sky News.
Do you really think that the British public want to see ICE-style deportations in this country?
I think the British public want to see fairness. And fairness is that you can't jump the queue, you can't illegally break into Britain, that you can't change communities, often without shape, because of lack of integration, and that you certainly can't jump to the top of the social housing list. I think that drives people absolutely mad. Now, in terms of operation, you know, we're going to learn lessons from the President of America. President Obama has a lot to teach us. You know, Obama deported far more illegals from America than did Trump, and yet there was no great hue and cry over this. It was considered to be perfectly reasonable and legal and sensible, just as Eisenhower had done many, many years before. And so all this focus on ICE and Trump, which sort of raises the temperature of everything, actually, there's a lot of ways in which Obama did it that we think we can learn from. And the vast majority of people, you know, once they're confronted with the truth that they shouldn't be in the country, once we send them back to a safe country with some money in their pocket to restart their lives, we'll do it, and we'll do so peaceably. And even under the controversial ICE and Trump administration, even there, you'll see of the deportations, over 75% are voluntary. So there are ways of doing this, but a lot to learn from President Obama. There really, really is. Thank you very much. Do you want to add to that?
No, look, the only thing I'd add to that is quite simple, that if you look at all of the polling, British people, the vast majority actually, the British people are in favour of the deportation of people who should not be in this country at all. And we would categorise people who broke into the country as absolutely within scope of that.
It's one of those issues where Westminster and the country are absolutely miles apart. You know, popular sort of dinner table conversation in Westminster and central London is a long, long, long way away from where it is once you get outside the M25. And by the way, that applies to Scotland and Wales as well. Amelia Jen, Channel 4 News.
Thanks very much. Your deputy leader, Richard Tice, hasn't denied fresh reports that he failed to pay up to £100,000 worth of tax benefiting an account that donated large amounts of money to Reform UK. Now that his tax affairs are directly linked to your party, will you be investigating?
So I remember this all happening 10 years ago. 10 years ago, Richard Tice came out publicly as a Brexiteer, and guess what happened? What always happens? An immediate investigation into him by HMRC, as happens to all of us that dare to take on the system. Big investigation, media around it. At the end of it, it was discovered he'd overpaid tax, and HMRC actually gave him a rebate. And here we are 10 years on, we're going through the same process. I would just say a couple of things very clearly about now. You know, one, I'm not surprised, because this is somebody in business, you know, who's had a lot of different companies under his operation. So I'm not surprised that it's happening. Secondly, of course, you must remember that the accuser is a Labour Party activist, and I think that's quite an important point.
Labour Party activist. Why has he investigated Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner?
Well, Angela Rayner he did do, but he is a Labour Party activist, and you'll find there have been a lot more attacks on us than they have on the other. And as Richard says, all of this was done by professional accountants, and he has spoken to HMRC about it. If there's a problem, he will pay. But it's likely that there's not a problem, because someone like Richard, who, by the way, you know, has run big PLCs in this country during his business career. I mean, you know, the guy is not there to make mistakes and employs the top professionals. And look, you know what? I read that article yesterday. I then read it again, slowly and carefully, and I was more confused at the end than I had been at the start. And it's very easy to throw accusations around about people's tax. You know, all I would say to you is that Richard Tice has had a long, distinguished career in business. And if there is an error, if his accountants have made an error, he'll put it right. But I very, very much doubt that that will be the case. OK, Martin Beckford from the Mail.
Thank you. You said in answer to a previous question just then that you'll send them back to a safe country with some money in their pocket. So for people whose asylum claims you're revoking, are you saying that they would be given money? And would you expect people to be able to go back to countries like Afghanistan and Iran? Thank you.
Well, the Afghan government have already said that they would be prepared to accept people back from this country. They've already said it. I mean, I've already got provisional agreements in place with France, if Bardella becomes the next president, and with Afghanistan. I've probably achieved more on this, being nowhere near government, than the Conservatives and Labour have over the course of the last 7 or 8 years, once this has become, a real crisis. So I'm confident we can do that. Zia, if it's there are other safe countries that we could send people to.
Yeah, and look, on the point about Afghanistan, we get this time and again, would you send people back to Afghanistan? Well, the Germans have been routinely sending people back to Afghanistan via the Qataris. It's been happening already. So these things are already being done. The only thing that's been missing is a Prime Minister who actually has the force of will to get things done, flanked by enough MPs in Parliament, a sovereign parliament, to actually get these things done. It is, on the one hand, extremely difficult because obviously the evidence of the last 20 years is that that's never become close to happening. On the other hand, it's actually really easy if the gentleman sat to my left is the Prime Minister and we have 326 plus Reform MPs. That will happen very quickly indeed.
Thank you. Charles Hymas, Daily Telegraph.
Hi, Charles Hymas from the Daily Telegraph. On mentioned Afghanistan, which sounds you've got a provisional agreement. Could you give me any more details on the terms of that provisional agreement? Have you got any assurances about how they'll treat people who are taken back, and who have you got the agreement with? And then secondly, one of the obviously with your proposal today, you're talking about potentially 1 million people who are going to be returned or deported potentially. How will you detain them all, given you've got 28,000 you talked about in your previous document? Now you've upped it, so obviously you're probably going to need more detention capability. Are you considering alternatives like, for example, prison ships?
In terms of detention, yeah, this is the scale of the problem. Or should I say, the scale of the failure that we will inherit if we succeed at the next general election is absolutely huge. But we do expect most people to voluntarily accept that they are here illegally, that they will have to go. And by the way, we'll say to all of them, if you want to reapply for a work visa based on the skills you've got, we're more than prepared to listen. Now, how many will want to do that? I don't know. Yeah, these are huge, huge problems. There will be very large numbers of people out there, waiting for the knock at the door. But as I say, Obama managed to do it without mass detentions of vast numbers of people. They just worked methodically through and did achieve a very, very high level of success.
Can I just quickly add to that? So one of the misconceptions is if you're going to deport, let's say, 100,000 people, you've got to have 100,000 people detained simultaneously. It's simply not the case, right? So you only need to, broadly, you can deport the number of people you can detain within a single month, right? That's a broad, sensible thing if you look at America that has run a mass deportation program across decades. Now, the key element to this is that is subject to flights not getting injuncted constantly. So, if we clear the decks legislatively, which is our plan, we pass primary legislation and those flights are leaving, then even the existing detention capacity we've already announced would actually allow us to deport, theoretically, 1 million people through a single term. So there's actually not necessarily any change in that. It's simply a case of us saying, look, if you broke into the country illegally, you're not going to get to stay.
On Afghanistan, look, there's no detail on this. That would be premature. But I stated very publicly that, like the Germans, who, by the way, send aircraft every week now that transit through to Afghanistan, there's no problem. There's no wild rebellion in Germany about doing this. It's all considered to be perfectly reasonable and sensible. And a public statement from Afghanistan to say they'd be more than prepared to do that with us.
Would it be women and children?
Well, you know what? We'll come to the detail of it nearer the time. But the principle, do you want to establish the principle? The idea that we've been living with for years is that no other government would agree to do anything. And already I've got them saying, Afghanistan saying what they're saying, and Bardella, who I've made it perfectly clear to, that if the French don't do their job properly, we will tow the boats back to northern France. And whilst he might have gulped a bit hard when I said it, publicly said to your newspaper, actually, that evening, that he's prepared to accept the principle. So we are laying some groundwork. I think to go any further than that in detail would be slightly premature. But some of those principles, at least, are being established.
But also, just the final point I make on that is, in terms of what we're talking about today, the vast majority of the people we're talking about are military-aged men with no dependents. You know, so let's focus on that.
Yeah. Jonathan Walker, Daily Express.
Thank you. What will the financial incentive be for people to leave voluntarily? Is it hundreds or thousands? How much are you going to offer them? And can I also ask about your, in Operation Restoring Justice, you talk about mandatory biometric data collection for anybody who has contact with the police in order to identify people who shouldn't be here. What does that mean? Does that mean if the police stop me, I'd have to give my fingerprints? And what would happen if I said no?
Can I quickly just...
do.
Yeah, just on that. So that's being very specific. So what we're talking about there is this new agency, Deportation Command, would have the ability to move into particular areas where there was reasonable suspicion that there were a lot of illegal migrants, just like a knife crime policy around stop and search, where even existing legislation allows police, senior officers can say, okay, this is an area, it's a hot spot, we're going to use our discretion to move into that area. In that context, then yes, it's really important that there is data sharing across government departments to ensure that people who should not be in this country legally, should not even be in this country, if they're making contact with the British state, it's important that we are aware that they're there and they can be then detained and deported. That's absolutely necessary.
In terms of financial incentives to return, let me tell you something. Not the 40 grand per family that Shababa Mahmood's proposing. Crikey. You'd just do the trip, wouldn't you? Again and again and again. No, what we're saying is, and again, it gets back to, we want as much cooperation as possible to make this work in terms of numbers, that it's an air ticket, and it's up to £1,000 in money, which basically in most of those countries would give people a reasonable start back and would, after just a few short weeks, start to save the British taxpayer a very, very large sum of money. Noah Hoffman, The Sun.
Thank you. We've seen over the past week a sustained campaign of attacks on Jews in the UK. We've had Keir Starmer give his bog standard thoughts and prayers, which were very reassuring, no doubt. What would you do to actually make a difference so that people in this country have been here for so many years, paid their taxes, worked hard, contributed to society at all levels, are no longer under threat from Islamic extremists?
I had a piece published in today's Jewish Chronicle on this very subject. And yes, frankly, the Prime Minister, time after time, our thoughts and prayers are with the Jewish community just is not good enough. It would appear he's not prepared to lift a finger. First thing I would say is this, especially in North London, it's kind of like we're just leaving the CST. Now, the CST, Gerald Ronson heading it up, does an amazing job of protecting schools and Jewish communities. And yes, whilst it does get some funding from central government, has to raise most of it itself. And they feel, and by the way, a huge admiration for what the CST do. Absolutely no question about that. But they feel that there isn't really very much direct help from the police, and they're beginning to feel increasingly isolated. And the most important thing about a civilized society is that the law applies equally to everybody. And if there is a particular group under direct threat, it is the job of the state to make sure they can live normal lives and worship, their kids can go to school and go about their lives freely. And there is a very, very strong feeling from that community that this simply isn't happening. And that whilst he talks kind words occasionally about the Jewish community, this is a government busy looking at putting into law some definition of Islamophobia, which would make even questioning the religion something fairly akin to blasphemy. And you can see the numbers. I mean, you can see the size of the Muslim voting population, or in particular the Pakistani, Kashmiri, Bangladeshi population, and a Prime Minister terrified they're going to lose that vote, which was a bloc Labour vote, to the Greens. So is it any wonder that the Jewish community... And by the way, I've seen all this before. 20 years I was in Brussels, and I watched as the centre of Brussels became somewhere that Jewish people could not safely live, and they fled that city, and they went to Israel, America, or whatever they did. And the only Jews that felt comfortable staying in Brussels were wealthy ones who lived in gated communities with their own direct private security. So I've seen this play out over other parts of Europe, and I fear that what we're witnessing, which was in slow motion, but now after the last few weeks appears to be at high speed, is a community who will effectively, unless something really strong and radical is done, be forced out of the areas from which they live. And I think it's that serious. Thank you. George Lithgow, Press Association.
Would you seek to agree a new beach patrol style deal with France? And if so, what would it look like?
Not much point, really, is there? What's the point? I mean, even if you stop a boat, all they do is run back to the sand dunes and come back tomorrow. And the sheer practical problem... I mean, look, of course we're annoyed with the French. I mean, the whole escorting thing, which I was the first person to expose, the escorting. The dinghy's 100 yards off the shore, and the French Navy escort the boat all the way, have their little chat on channel 11 or 12, whatever they're using, with the British authority. Hi, chaps, I've got 60 here for you. Hi, guys, I've got 200 here for you. Yeah, that's fine, great stuff, look forward to seeing you. And this sort of gentlemanly exchange of people that goes on in the middle of the channel. Yeah, of course, I'm pretty appalled by all of that. As I say, just stopping the boats on the beach makes no difference whatsoever. None. And actually, if you look at it, I mean, now you've got boats launching from as far west as Berck, occasionally, not always, but they do launch from Berck sometimes, to as far east as the Belgian side of Dunkirk. So you're now looking at well over 100 miles stretch they could potentially launch from. Plus, in many of these areas, vast areas of sand dunes. Quite why on the south coast we've got all the shingle and they've got all the sand, I'm not sure. But there are vast areas where people can hide, where they're tough to detect, even with heat-seeking equipment. So there are practical problems with stopping the boats. But the only way it happens, the only way, we can blame everybody else. Today we're blaming the Belgians in the newspapers. We can blame everybody else. The only people to blame are ourselves. And that's why we've done this press conference this morning, to iterate more strongly than ever before, that if you come to Britain illegally, you will not be allowed to stay. Then they'll stop coming. Thank you. Kate Devlin, The Independent.
Thank you, Kate Devlin from The Independent. Today is the anniversary of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, and you're making a speech about deporting migrants. Is the date a coincidence, or have you done this on purpose? And if I may, as we get close to the end of the 2-week Iran ceasefire, if you were talking to your friend Donald Trump right now, what would you advise him to do?
End the war as quickly as possible. End the war as quickly as possible. Yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, clearly Iran's nuclear capability has been seriously destabilised, but the problem is that, we could be back here again in 3 or 4 years' time, and that perhaps is my biggest worry about it. I've no idea what intelligence he was given going into this. I reiterate, it was a mistake for us to block him to begin with, and then change our minds and allow him to use the bases. But yeah, let's get this over with as quickly as we possibly can. And hopefully, let's learn the lessons. That, currently for oil, most of our importers are paying $135 a barrel. And all this nonsense about, the global price of oil. No, it's not, global price of gas. It's utter rot. If we were producing our own gas, particularly in this country, then domestic energy bills and industrial bills would be much, much, much cheaper. And quite why the government or Parliament doesn't understand that if you import gas, natural gas from America, it's drilled in Montana, it's liquefied, it's taken to the East Coast, it's taken across the Atlantic, it's regassed and then used. That is different to what any global spot price for gas would be, because it costs a fortune to do those things. And I've tried so hard I've tried so hard to make these arguments over the last few weeks. Quite frankly, as a former commodity trader, I might just know something about it. And I find myself banging my head against the brick wall of people who just do not want to listen. And I'm afraid the net zero agenda, the excessive taxation that Jeremy Hunt brought in to onshore, they banned onshore, but offshore drilling for oil and gas. We've literally killed an industry. So I hope what we learn from this is we should not be this exposed to supply chains. We should be self-sufficient in these things, let alone the Royal Navy. I can absolutely promise you, that we didn't choose the 20th of April for any specific reason. It just happens to be a Monday, and we happen to do press conferences on Mondays quite regularly throughout the year. And I would emphasise one other thing to those of you who might be tempted to think that we as a party have headed in a nativist or even racial direction. The sheer number of ethnic minority candidates that we're standing in this campaign, especially in London, is remarkable, quite remarkable. We haven't made a song and dance about it. We don't. We just don't. We don't really care if people are men or women or black or white or whatever they are or what their chosen preferences are. We really want to judge people as, for who they are and what they can do. Such is our belief in meritocracy. But I would add that the online abuse on X that our minority candidates are receiving is utterly appalling in every way. And if it was happening to any other candidates from more established parties in the sense of their age, you would all be in total uproar. And I've not heard a single person comment on it. It really, really is bad. And X is now becoming a very unpleasant and very dangerous place. Anna Gross, FT.
Hi, thanks a lot. This policy today is obviously quite a big departure, as you've said, from what the Tories and Labour have done before. Is it also, because it's retrospective and not just forward-looking to new people who arrive, is it somewhat about sort of trying to reverse the demographic changes that we've seen over the past sort of 20 years, accelerating a lot over the past sort of 5-10 years that Matthew Goodwin wrote about extensively in his recent book? Is that partly why it's retrospective, or is it something else? And I just wanted to clarify one thing, Nigel, that because you said these people could be sent back to safe. There are plenty of other safe countries these people could be sent back to. Are you saying that people would only ever be sent back to countries that are deemed safe, or which was my understanding of the policy? It doesn't matter whether they're safe or not safe. We will send them back.
Well, it doesn't matter whether they're culturally different, but it depends whether they're safe. I would suggest actually France is quite safe. So perhaps the first thing we should do is send some people back to France. That wouldn't be a bad start. Look, the only reason we're looking at this retrospectively is because we feel the law has been broken. That groups of British lawyers who are part of the illegal immigration industry have been telling people, claim this, claim that, claim Y, and you will be able to stay in this country. Now, we laid out some ideas on that last week, quite how the legal profession can look in the shaving mirror, given how they're behaving, to subvert the law in this country. I mean, if they were accountants, back to the earlier question we had about business, if they were accountants, they'd face prosecution, criminal prosecution. And we think actually that the same should apply to the legal profession. So we're doing it because, frankly, this has been abused, the law's been abused, and frankly, the way that the legal profession have been interpreting what human rights and freedoms ought to be is contrary to our national interests. So we believe that by doing this, we are righting a wrong. Ben Quinn from The Guardian.
Thanks. For Mr. Yusuf, there will be cases where there are asylum seekers who will have had children here in the UK. What should happen to those UK-born children and their rights to have a parent remaining here? And for Mr. Farage, on a separate question, can you tell us a little bit about how and when you came to know Ben Dello And did you happen to have any discussions in relation to the Trump administration's decision to grant him a pardon?
No, I didn't. Ben Dilo has been supporting a variety of conservative causes for a very, very long time. Quite a wide range of causes that he's supported. And yes, he's become very, very strongly supportive of us. But there have been no conversations with the Trump administration about, or frankly, about anything for quite a considerable period of time.
Yeah, look, in terms of our views and our policies with regards to men, women and children, I'd go back to the original point. Anytime you're going to have a policy like this that says we're going to undo the wrongs that have happened over a significant period of time, where people, as I said, have turned up in this country illegally without the consent or permission of the British people. We've had successive governments who have just allowed that, the trampling of our laws. We're not going to give an amnesty to those people. So I want to reiterate, of the close to 200,000 people who have turned up on our beaches since 2018, the vast majority are not only men, they are men without dependents and of military age from countries. The countries from which they originate, I know they've come from France, obviously, as Nigel said, not exactly a war zone, but the countries from which they originally come are most frequently Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Eritrea. And so, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to prioritise, as Nigel has said. We're going to firstly focus on those military-age men without dependents, and then we'll go from there. And one other point I want to make is we spent a lot of time studying countries that have successfully embarked upon mass deportation policies, emphasis on successfully. And what you will see is, if you look at the data from America, including and especially the Obama administration, but it's happened under Trump as well, is where enforcement becomes real. And people realize that when you get a letter from, in this case it would be deportation command, saying you've got a period of time to leave the country voluntarily and a little bit of money, not £40,000, a little bit of money to go home and a flight. If they realize it, and it's crystal clear that should they not take up that offer, then enforcement does actually happen. What you see is voluntary departures go through the roof. And that's why, as Nigel says, where Obama managed to deport millions, the majority of those people did leave voluntarily, but that was because he actually did, as president, run a very successful enforcement program. That's exactly what we would do.
Very good. Thank you, everybody.